Hello. Doing this last set of videos outside has been quite eye-opening for me. If I lived in a sort of metropolitan, cosmopolitan area, no one would bat an eye at seeing a guy talking to a camera. Because I live in a quite traditional working class British seaside town, that means that if anyone sees anyone out doing content creation, they walk past them and go, "Wang ah, wang ah." So it's been very eye-opening. And if you ever feel like I give advice on this channel that I wouldn't take myself, and I'm constantly being like, do things that scare you, reach out to people, collaborate, take risks, all of that stuff, and I wouldn't do it myself, then I want you to understand that when I'm out in the wild doing a video outside, even though this is a game development channel, then I'm basically trying to challenge myself in those same sort of ways of like doing things that make me feel uncomfortable, because I think that's a really important thing for game developers to do. But the topic I wanted to cover in this video isn't about any of that. It is, what do we mean when we call a game an indie game? I do consulting, I do kind of freelancing where people give me a game to look at and they don't want it on the channel, they want some just private help, some private design help, or maybe they want a teardown where I go through the game for like 4 hours and come back with a big document saying, here's what I think the problems are with your game. When I started this channel and the kind of consultancy business that attached to it, I wanted to only work with indie games. I've had a few different kind of calls for work through for games that I would personally not consider indie games, and this has kind of made me think a little bit about this definition and this distinction. So I want to talk about why I have this distinction. I'm not the dictionary police. I'm not in charge of what words mean. You have indie as a shortening of independent, right? And by independently produced games, we mean games where the developer gets to make what they want, right? They're not being told what to make by some funder. That doesn't necessarily mean they have no funding. It means that they are creatively independent from their funding source. And you might have opinions about that, whatever they are, but I would just bear in mind that every game is funded in some way. Right? So when Stardew Valley was being made, it was funded by the developer's partner looking after him financially all that time, right? That's still funding of some sort. You could even stretch that metaphor even further and say, if he had been making Baby Murderer Simulator, she might not have funded him and she might not have supported him in that way. But, the kind of loosest sense of what independent means is the developer has creative control over what they make, right? And then if you kind of link that through to indie games as something that people enjoy and something that people identify with as gamers, and they say, I'm an indie gamer, then the reason you get those sorts of people is because the creative freedom afforded by that type of development leads to different types of games that audience enjoy. They don't like the game just because it's made independently in the abstract. They like it because the independence leads to games getting made that wouldn't get made by massive companies, right? I've heard people say before, oh, AAA games aren't really AAA because they're low quality and I don't think they're very good. The term AAA doesn't actually describe the quality of something. It describes the economic sort of scale of it. It's a term that comes from finance, and it means like big but safe financial gambles. So whatever games are made at any time, the largest, most expensive games will always be the AAA games. That's what AAA means. It's just a kind of financial bracket, right? And you can even have AAA games that are technically independent games. So CD Projekt Red are an example of that. CD Projekt Red make their own games. They are their own publisher. They fund their own games. They have full creative control over what they make. Most of us would look at The Witcher or the Cyberpunk games and say that is a AAA game, but it still fulfills some of the things that we associate with being independent as well, even though we wouldn't think of it as an indie game because we tend to think indie games are small. Why this is all relevant to what I said at the beginning about freelancing is often people get in touch with me and they want me to help them with a mobile game, and they want me to help them with a mobile free-to-play game. And this is where these definitions get difficult for me because I worked in free-to-play for several years. I worked at a couple of different mobile studios. And the thing is that when you make a free-to-play game that has kind of monetization in it or has adverts in it or something like that, it does kind of define and dictate the game design to some degree. I've had people say, no, I'm making a mobile game and it's going to be free, it's going to have ads in, but I'm not going to do any of that stuff, blah, 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 blah. Why are you doing it then? Either make a game that costs $1 and make money from the dollar, or be serious about making a free-to-play game. and kind of learn how to do that properly and execute it properly. Like, I personally don't want to work on free-to-play games. I don't want to work with free-to-play developers because I think it's impossible to do them well without relying on things like, you know, addiction, psychology and Skinner boxes and stuff like that. And I've done my time there, and now I just kind of want to work with people that are making interesting indie games. So the problem that comes here is that people who are working independently think they're indie developers and think that what they're making are indie games, even if gamers would never recognize them as such. For my kind of personal taste and my personal ethics as a designer, I don't really think like a free-to-play game that is made independently really fulfills the criteria of what people would think is an indie game. Again, there's always that assumption with indie games, and I'm saying this from my own perspective, but I'm also saying it to sort of give you an insight into how I think players and consumers of indie games think, is that it's like a subculture like punk or something like that, right? These people have a value system where they think there is something wrong with AAA cash grabbing development, not just AAA, but like mobile free-to-play companies and stuff like that. There is something wrong with this business model and what it produces, and, you know, I want to vote with my wallet and support companies that aren't that. The problem is, if you're making a free-to-play game, it doesn't really matter if you're a solo independent developer or a studio of 100 people. If your game is free-to-play, you are going to always end up leaning on those kind of monetization methods and like addiction-based design and all of that kind of stuff, because that's the only way that you can get 1% of an audience to give you any money in one of those sorts of games. So it's a weird one, because when I set up the design consultancy side of what I do and say, hey, indie developers, I want to work with you, I did not expect people to get in touch being like, help me with my free-to-play mobile game. And yet we see that time and time again. And I think it really just comes down to people not understanding what the indie games audience is or what it's responding to. These people don't enjoy indie games just because they're independently produced. They enjoy indie games because that independence produces particular types of games. They don't like them just because they're indie. They don't like them just because the person was like bootstrapping, chutzpah, making something all on their own. Like, that's part of it. That's part of the kind of ideological makeup of what makes an indie game indie and why do gamers care about that. But it's not enough on its own. That production context, that finance context has to also produce something they like. And if what it produces is just like a basically Clash of Clans but made by an indie developer, then it's not got the same value to them as like a premium game that they buy off Steam that was made just to sell a game and not to sell ad space or try and get you to cough up for some diamonds that do practically nothing in the game or whatever. This conversation about what makes an indie game indie has been going on a very long time. There's even been academic papers about it. I think the game was Deathspank, which was one of the first big cases where, you know, it was kind of like, astroturfing, the idea of astroturfing, where you make something look grassroots, but it's fake, it's actually corporate. Deathspank was criticised for this because it was a game made by a big publisher, but it was made to sort of appeal to the tastes of the indie game audience. You know, just to kind of reiterate some of my personal context is, I worked in free-to-play games for a very long time, and one of the reasons I set this channel up is that I don't want to do that anymore, and I don't want that to be my contribution to the world. That means that if you've got a game that you want help with and it's in that design space, I don't really want to help you with that. Maybe I will if I'm desperate, but I will charge you 4 times the amount to work on a game if it has a gacha or ad-driven stuff in it, because I've just done enough of that in my time. I can understand why, if you're making games independently, you would think, well, that means I'm an indie dev and the games I make are indie games. But I think it's a much more complicated question than that. And the definitions I've given here are personal to me. But, you know, I think that's generally how most people who are players and consumers of indie games think about it. The context in which you make things matters, but it doesn't matter more than what you make. You still have to make something good and make something that contributes something positive to the world and isn't just there as a cash grab.